Hundreds of people arrested in Russia and a leading opposition politician jailed. Protesters say President Putin's opponents are being excluded from taking part in Moscow's city elections. Why is the government taking such a hard stance? And could violence against the demonstrators backfire? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hashim Ahalbarra. It's one of the biggest security crackdowns seen in Russia for many years against what the authorities say are illegal demonstrations. An independent monitoring group says more than 800 protesters were detained on Saturday. The week before, the figure was almost 1,400. And the leading opponent of President Vladimir Putin, Alexei Navalny, was jailed. Russians are angry at the ban on some opposition-minded candidates for the next month's city elections in Moscow. The council, controlled by the pro-Kremlin United Russia Party, is responsible for a large municipal budget. The vote comes at a time when Putin's approval rating, although still high at more than 60%, has actually dropped. And that's been put down to discontent over the economy and falling incomes. We'll discuss all this with our guests shortly. But first, Imran Khan reports on Saturday's events.
A police operation designed to stop large numbers of protesters coming to central Moscow did exactly that. Still, some did manage to get through, but detentions were swift.
So all throughout Saturday, they've been arresting people like this. They pick them up and they take them into a van where their IDs will be checked. The protesters are normally taken to a police station to then be registered.
Journalists were also detained but released almost immediately once they showed proper accreditation. Protesters are worried that upcoming Moscow City Council elections are being rigged in favor of the governing party, United Russia. Most of the opposition candidates have been arrested, but one, who was at the protest, said the numbers were low because the authorities were cracking down.
Everything depends on how people will react. So far, there aren't that many of us. Many people are unhappy with United Russia, and the support is the lowest since 2006. But people are scared of coming to the streets and taking part in rallies. If 500,000 take to the streets, things will change.
Despite the crackdown, the protesters that did make it were hopeful change might come.
I'm here because I have a conscience and I don't like a lot of things that are happening in this country. I'm happy that the young generation woke up and want to have their voices heard.
I'm here because candidates weren't allowed to run. I'm against banning of rallies. I'm against the crackdown. And I think protest is the only way to show your opinion.
Police say the protest was illegal and detentions were low. An opposition monitoring group says the numbers will be much higher than the police will claim. It's not clear what's next for Russia's protest movement, but the authorities are hoping this show of force has stopped it completely. Imran Khan, Al Jazeera, Moscow.
The arrests were condemned by rights groups. In a statement, Amnesty International said the Russian authorities have shown nothing but disdain for human rights and the notion of peaceful protest. We call on the Russian authorities to respect the country's human rights obligations and constitution and ensure the right to freedom of peaceful assembly is respected and facilitated. The unfounded mass disorder charges against demonstrators must be dropped and all imprisoned peaceful protesters released. So who are the main activists challenging President Putin? Lyubov Sobol, a lawyer and video blogger, was briefly detained before Saturday's protests. She'd been on hunger strike after her disqualification from the election. Alexei Navalny is Putin's most prominent opponent. Last week, the anti-corruption campaigner was taken to hospital from prison in what his lawyer said might have been a case of poisoning. He's now back in jail serving a 30-day sentence for organizing the protests. Several other opposition members and activists were also detained, but some were later released. Critics say the Kremlin has always used force to intimidate dissenters. Let's bring in our guests. From Moscow, we have Viktor Olivich, political analyst and lead expert at the Center for Actual Politics. Also from Moscow, Pavel Flegenhauer, a journalist and columnist for Novaya Gazeta. Welcome to the program. Mr. Olivich, why is this happening? I mean, this clampdown on the protesters, and how significant is it?
Well, unfortunately, the Moscow Municipal Election Commission had made a decision not to register candidates, a number of candidates from opposition movements and parties. And it had become widely accepted that that decision was not exactly by the book. So the Moscow Municipal Election Commission had been political in making that decision and did not exactly act according to law. Of course, that was used as a pretext for protests by the more radical parts of the opposition. But it must be said, that the discontent, that the number of people who feel disenfranchised in Moscow is significant. And not every protest, like yesterday's protest, is not allowed, is banned by the Russian authorities. In fact, 2 weeks ago, there was a legal protest that was licensed by the government, and more than 20,000 people came out. In fact, a week from now, another protest is expected in Moscow, focused on this specific issue, the elections to the Moscow City Duma. And the authorities expect up to 100,000 people to come out. And that protest is not expected to be harassed in any way by the police. So on the one hand, there are issues that have been caused by decisions of the Moscow city authorities, the Moscow Election Commission. And on the other hand, there have been attempts by the more radicalized elements of the opposition to use them as a pretext for their actions.
Mr. Flegenhauer, why such a hard stance when it's all about city elections? I mean, we're not talking about the Duma elections. We're not talking about the presidential elections, which are going to be held in 2024.
Well, it seems that the Moscow authorities are grossly overreacting. Indeed, the Moscow City Duma, the legislature that will be elected in September, doesn't yield any real power. It's not even a professional so-called legislature. I mean, it's part-time people. They're not even paid for that work. They sometimes gather to pass some kind of legislation, and there was zero possibility that the opposition could actually gain a majority in this legislature or could wield any power out of there. But the authorities are dealing with this like a military operation, basically. There have been reliable information coming out from sources in the Kremlin that this is seen as an act of, this unrest in Moscow is seen as an act of hybrid warfare. That this is a Western American-led intelligence organizations organizing discontent in Russia in an attempt to turn it into a possible coup d'etat like it was in Ukraine, the so-called Maidan, and that has been, the Russian authorities has been very afraid of that. And so now they're clamping down real hard. They're arresting people, all the leaders of opposition, all the known leaders of the opposition, or most of them, are right now behind bars. They're running searches. They're looking for information, and the counterintelligence organization FSB is very much involved. So they're looking for evidence to show that this is a hybrid war operation by the West, and that maybe they're actually preparing some show trials afterwards.
If they see it that way, Victor, usually a city election is usually about infrastructure, about services, and there's this consensus among many people, particularly in the government, that the mayor, who is an ally of President Putin, has been doing well over the last few years. Why is the government afraid in this case? Why is it afraid and not allowing the opposition candidates to run for the city in the city elections?
Well, I would agree with Pavel that the Moscow city government has overreacted And the proper way to deal with this situation would have been to register those candidates who actually received enough signatures to be registered, to play by the book, and to have free and fair elections. And in fact, the popularity, the ratings of some of these opposition candidates are quite low. So in free and fair elections, if they were held in September to the Moscow City Duma, most of them would have probably not achieved victory. Most of these opposition candidates, they would have simply lost in fair elections. Instead, by clamping down severely, by taking these somewhat unnecessary actions, these opposition, including radical opposition figures and activists, have gained more name recognition. Their reputation has, among certain layers of the population in Moscow, certain segments of the population, their brand name recognition has increased, and their popularity has increased. So these actions by the Moscow authorities are certainly counterproductive from whatever vantage point you look at it.
Pavel, has the clampdown backfired to the point where we can say safely now that the opposition is now on the path to build up more momentum for its own political agenda?
Oh, that's not clear at all. In 2012, such a very severe clampdown actually stopped the opposition movement. Then after the Duma elections, the State Duma elections, that was rather more massive than today. So then it worked. Most likely the authorities believe it can work now too. But again, that depends on other issues. It's not just about Moscow, though. This right now is a Moscow city issue. It's Moscow elections. It's happening in Moscow. There's very little resonance to the entire countryside of Russia. But right there, the authorities they're afraid, and they have a reason to be afraid, because this basically political opposition movement in Moscow may begin to spread out and join forces with the socio-economic discontent that's really massive in Russia, because Russia is in economic doldrums. For over 6 years, household incomes have been declining. There's economic frustration. It's right now not public, and it's not connected at all to the elections and to the Moscow Council. But if they join forces, the affluent, more politicized Moscow public, with the social discontent in the Russian provinces, then the Russian authorities could be in really deep, serious trouble.
Victor, you said earlier that you don't think that the opposition candidates have any chance to win the city elections, even if they were given the permission to take part in the elections. However, don't you think that with the growing discontent nationwide about the track record of Putin and his government, this could tilt the balance in their own favor, in the favor of the opposition?
Well, most of them could not win in a free and fair election to the Moscow City Duma right now. Some of them, several of them, could possibly have won. And in fact, some of those that have now been registered, I would remind you that within the last week, between these protests, one of the opposition candidates from Yabloko, Sergei Mitrokhin, has been registered. The decision not to register him has been overturned. And so even in a free and fair election, the radical opposition candidates would simply not be able to get a majority. They're not that popular, and they would not even be able to get a significant portion of the seats in the Moscow State Duma. I would also look at similar or somewhat similar examples of long-term protest movements in various countries and how they go, what the results are. Usually, the best way to pacify a long-term, more or less wide-ranging protest movement is to compromise. We have already seen some elements of this in the registration of Sergei Mitrokhin from Yabloko. Also, I would point to some comments by the vice speaker of the Russian Duma, and this is the Federal Duma, this is the Russian Parliament, Alexander Zhukov from the United Russia Party, who had suggested that in the next Duma, the next Russian Parliament elections that are coming up in 2021, it is quite possible that one of the liberal parties will be able to get seats, which has not happened for a number of years in Russia. So, if these protests keep up, if they become more long-term, more widespread, then they can, of course, affect the Russian political landscape. We have seen similar effects in other countries.
Joining the discussion now from London, Domitila Sagromoza, an expert on Russian affairs and lecturer in security and development in the Department of War Studies at King's College, London. Domitila, there are two key opposition figures who seem to be now instrumental in the protest movement, Alexei Navalny and Lyubov Sobol. Do you see them able on their own to build up the momentum for the opposition and shaping the narrative for the future?
I think what is very interesting about this movement is that it follows some leaders, but at the same time, there are many new figures that are coming up. It's not just one or two, but there are a lot of young figures who wanted to become, to promote their candidacy for the local elections of the city council in Moscow. So there are a lot of new faces there that are also sort of pushing this movement. And also there are many people that are just complaining and protesting the situation and the so-called repression. So I think that there is a bit of a life of its own. It's becoming partly a sort of leaderless movement. But of course, these figures are important, and Lyubov Sobol is an important figure. She has been very powerful in her messages. She's on a 21-day hunger strike, so people are following her. The same with Ilya Yashin. There are many important figures that are becoming symbolic of these changes. So I think that there is a combination of both.
Pavel, Navalny is by far the most prominent opposition figure so far. Do you see him as a potential candidate to unify the opposition against Putin in the future?
Well, that seems very much possible because, of course, he's not taking part in this thing, but he's behind it to a large extent. Mr. Yashin and Ms. Sobol, they are actually working for him. They're from his organization. So he's backing them up. And he's presenting actually an alternative to the present regime, to the Russian public. That's his idea. It's not about this particular election. It's about, in general, the course of Russia. And he's offering an alternative for the future. And that could be important. Basically, the authorities are doing everything by the textbook. They have they're trying to split the opposition. They have detained almost all of the leaders. They are busting the organization of Navalny. And they are kind of using heavy-handed police tactics to against the people in the street to kind of get them out of the street.
Victor.
Basically, that should work. But we will see, can it work or not in a situation when there's so much social unrest and social tension in Russia?
I see your point. Victor, you have an economy which is in tatters, sanctions imposed by the international community, discontent, widespread discontent over the track record of President Putin's government. However, the opposition does not seem to be able to build bridges with the mainstream Russians. Why is it that?
Well, the level of support for the Russian President Putin and for the government is actually not that low. Of course, it has become lower than it was before because of the pension reform, because of some other economic issues, and the economy is not in the best of straits. However, it is still not in tatters, as you said, and so there is still some political capital, quite some political capital that the president and the government enjoys. At the same time, mistakes such as the one with not letting opposition candidates register with the Moscow State Duma, they very well serve as a pretext for opposition rallies, to increase opposition popularity, and of course we can expect more of this down the road. That is why it is important for the government to pacify the situation quickly and not by brute force, but by compromise.
Okay, Domitilla, what do you think the opposition should do to change things? Do they need to rebrand themselves?
I don't think they need to change something. I think they're being quite powerful. I'm of the view that this movement is maybe going to change things. It might take a lot of time, but I sense that the authorities are a bit at a loss as to how to handle it, because on the one hand, if they open up a bit the room for political participation, there is a risk that that could lead to further involvement by opposition parties. And at the same time, when they conduct repressions, they can perpetrate themselves in power for a while, but they also plant the seeds of their own sort of undoing. So they're in a very difficult situation now, with an economy which is not growing very fast, where there is a sense of stagnation. And I agree. I mean, Putin remains popular, but not as popular as before. And there is this whole debate as to what will happen in 2024. So my view is that the opposition is increasingly galvanized, and the repressions only help to bring people behind, opposition leaders. And the whole question of corruption is also something which is driving very much these movements. So I think that things are slightly changing as opposed to a few years ago.
Pavel, with the approval ratings of President Putin declining and with this ongoing protests on the streets, could this give us any indication about Putin's future, particularly post-2024?
Well, the entire Russian political system since the year 2000 has been built around Putin. He's an essential part of it. He is the arbiter general. He balances different groups, different interests. He does an enormous amount of actual personal work in running Russia. If something happens to Putin, and he's not a very young man, he's 66, approaching in October 67, and if he will not be able to play his role in the political system is going to melt down. It can't function without him. And that's a very serious problem for the future of Russia, that it all hinges on the workability, on the intellectual and physical conditions of one person, actually. The whole stability of the whole country. I think while Putin is there at the helm, I think he's going to prevail, but he can't stay there forever.
Domitilla, the path to democratic transition in Russia, which has been debated forever, is this something that could still take place in the future, or do you see it as a wishful thinking with the political establishment the way it is and Putin at the helm of the establishment?
I don't rule it out. I think that there is always a desire in Russia to, by many people, what I would call live under the rule of law and have a system that represents their interests and that there is progress and that there is political participation of some sort. And I think that, I can't predict if this will happen or not. It's impossible, but I think it cannot be ruled out and it should not be ruled out. And I think that the system that was set up, as was mentioned by Pavel, is very much centered around a figure. And when he's not around, it's not clear what will happen. There's going to be a lot of infighting. It's already happening. And I think that there is a possibility for the public to sort of capitalize on that. I think that the realities of Russia today are very different to the times when Putin was very, very popular. I think there is a new generation of Russians who has only seen Putin as a leader, who connects very much with the outside world, who hasn't experienced either communism or the 1990s. So they're not afraid of participating, interacting, engaging. And there are new challenges that Russia faces. So I think that things can change. And I think that we should not think that the system is as such will prevail forever.
Thanks to our guests, Viktor Olivich, Domitilla Sagromoso, and Pavel Flegenhauer. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashim Ahl Barra, the whole team here. Bye for now.